Good day. This is your sermon for Sunday, November the 15th, 2020. For those of you who are wanting to read ahead and look at next week's lesson, we're going to be looking at the story of Amos in the Old Testament and a little bit about the character that we can see there, what we can learn from that book. So if you want to read ahead, there is 9 chapters in the book of Amos. You'll have this week to do that. This week we're going to be looking at someone named Deborah. And we're going to read that story first. It's in Judges chapter 4. And actually there is Judges chapter 4 and chapter 5. But we'll just read together chapter 4. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, Go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun? And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kedesh. And Barak called out Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh. And 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Zaanannim, which is near Kedesh. When Sisera was told that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not a man was left. But Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said to him, Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid. So he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, Stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, Is anyone here? Say no. But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground, while he was lying fast asleep from weariness. So he died. And behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said to him, Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead, with the tent peg in his temple. So on that day God subdued Jabin the king of Canaan before the people of Israel, And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. What we have here is a description of a couple of very strong women, and for different reasons. We have Deborah, and we have the person of Jael, and we're probably not going to talk very much about Jael, but we will be talking about Deborah and the strong woman that she is, and not just the strong woman, but a strong woman of God. We'll look at her character a little bit and some of the roles that she had in the life that she lived, and also what God did to use her. And we will look at what we can learn from that for today, and take away and look a little bit about what God expects women to be and to do, and the role that he has for women to play in his kingdom. So first of all, we'll look at the characteristics of Deborah. First of all, we note obviously that she is a woman, and that's significant because she's the only female judge of Israel in the Old Testament. This is really the first mention of female leadership of the whole nation. The only other thing, it's not a completely foreign concept, but she's really the first one who seems to have this authority. The only other one that we might see in the Old Testament before this time would be Miriam, would be Moses' sister. When Moses was up on the mountain, they thought he was gone. We kind of see that Miriam has some standing. Even she tries to stand against Moses at one time with Aaron, and that doesn't turn out very well before the Lord. But we do see her being respected and revered by all the people. But we're talking about Deborah in this here. The book of Judges here in this case challenges the idea that God would never choose a woman to lead. And we will look a little bit about this and kind of the roles that she played, and maybe address our expectations a little bit of what that means. Deborah was also a wife. There's debate on what the phrase means when it says that she was the wife of Lapidoth. Some say that phrase in the Hebrew actually doesn't even say wife, but it just says woman of Lapidoth. And it depends on the context in what that would be used. So translators have chosen to mention it as the wife of Lapidoth. So the other alternate translation of what some of the commentators could say is that she was a woman of Lapidoth. But Lapidoth is never mentioned as a place in the Bible or anywhere else. So we don't see that. So it seems to be more of a conjecture or a trying to explain it some other way. There is the fact that Jewish names were very important. And literally this phrase, if it was a woman of Lapi or Lapid, I believe the Hebrew is, it would literally be woman of torches. And some of the commentators that I read said that this is still a stretch. It's not necessarily supported by any evidence, but traditionally this is described and ascribed to as her husband, Lapidoth, and so that's what we'll look at here. So Deborah was a woman, she was a wife, but she also had some very unusual characteristics in that next she was a prophetess. We don't see that very much in the Bible, but there are a few women who have this designation as a prophetess. A prophetess would be someone who is chosen by God, and we can clearly see that God had plenty of men to choose from. There was over 10,000 just in this army, but God chooses Deborah. And the prophetess or the prophet, their job was to speak the word of the Lord to the people. And not just the word of the Lord, but the will of the Lord as well. And it seems that the Spirit of the Lord was on Deborah, like it was with the other judges who stood up and rescued Israel. God spoke to Deborah to give the messages to the people. So he spoke to her, and she gave the messages to the people, or whoever she needs to deliver them to, whether it was the whole nation or whether it was Barak or wherever God had sent her to go. Sometimes the prophets or the prophetesses, they would predict the future on what was going to come to pass. And in this case, Deborah actually does predict the future, that they're going to win this battle, and that the glory is going to go to a woman and not to the commander of the army who normally it would go to. So we see that Deborah is a prophetess, a very special designation given by God, blessed by God in this way. She's also a judge. And this is a little bit different of something that we see. She's only the only female judge that is mentioned as well here. She would sit down, it says, under the palm of Deborah. They named a tree after her, and that they don't usually name things after someone who is obscure or unimportant. But we see that when somebody sat down, that was a sign that they were using some authority and that people were to pay attention to them, and she would sit down to judge at this place. And the people came to her for judgment. She seems to be someone who is wise and discerning and fair, and maybe to what degree we don't know, but we do know this: she was loved and trusted, at least looked up to by the people in order to judge them properly, or they would not have come to her. And I would think that even she would have had to be someone who was exceptional in all of these areas, seeing that she was a woman, and some of the challenges that went along even with the gender roles in that day. But she was a judge of all of Israel. And just like just like all of the judges that came before her in regards to this, and we'll look at that a little bit more too, she was a woman of power. Deborah was very unusual in this. The Spirit of the Lord was on her, and she was like Shamgar or Ehud or Samson, some of the judges that were before that had great power, that obviously the blessing of the Lord was on them, and it was plain for everybody to see. She is a woman of power in that she summons Barak, and she tells him to come. Some of the prophets had done that before with kings, and and afterwards the prophets would summon the king or whoever God wanted them to, but she summoned Barak and tells him to assemble the army like God has already told him to do. She reminds him that God's already told him to do this, so she's basically pushing him to do what God has already told him to do. And we realize that she's a woman of power and influence in this. Barak is not going to go or to assemble the army without her. If she goes, he'll go. If she doesn't go, he's not going to go. But God is with Deborah, and it's obvious to everyone. And one more thing that we see about Deborah, just before we kind of look at what God does through her, is that we see that she's a singer or a songwriter in this. She sings together with Barak after God's victory. So after the war is won, they sing this song together. Judges chapter 5 is called the Song of Deborah and Barak, and you can read that, and it's a little bit more descriptive even than the narrative of what happens in the war. There's some details that are provided in there, maybe filling in some blanks or even causing more questions. Often songs will do that. They give details, but in a little bit more of an obscure way. But what Deborah does in this is she beautifies what the Lord has done. The Lord has delivered them from tyranny, from a very cruel Canaanite king, and she beautifies what the Lord has done and puts it into a song and sings it together with Barak. So these are some of the characteristics that we see of really a very unusual woman in this, that we really don't see much of that in a very prominent leadership role in the Old Testament. And second of all, as we look at that character and the roles that she played, we see that God uses her. Second of all, He uses her in a couple of ways. He uses her in her leadership. And she's not a warrior like Samson or David is going to be later, but it seems she's every bit as much of a leader and every bit as much blessed by God and the Spirit of the Lord being on her. She is what you might say in charge, both spiritually and civilly in the nation of Israel. So she's like a ruler over the nation, a judge at least, not mentioned as a king because they didn't have a king yet. God was still their king, but Israel would backslide and go away, and then God would send a judge to deliver them, and Deborah is one of these judges, but he uses her leadership in the nation of Israel. And I think he does this, as we looked at David last week, as he slew Goliath. David wanted everybody to know that there was a God in Israel. And I believe that's exactly how God uses Deborah's leadership, is to show that there is a God in Israel. And God uses Deborah to deliver his people. They have cried out to him. They've done evil in his eyes. They've gone away from him. They've worshipped other gods. They have not followed the law as they have been commanded. But God allows them to be cruelly treated for 20 years by this King Jabin, this Canaanite king, and Sisera, his general in the army. This pandemic that we're going through right now, what is that compared to 20 years of tyranny? Maybe something small so far. But Sisera, the commander of King Jabin's army, is going to be delivered and killed by the woman Jael. No glory for men in this story, only women. And God has a plan to deliver his people, and this is the way that he does it. He uses both Deborah and Jael to bring this about. And God's plan is to deliver the whole nation. And this is in God's way, for his glory, that they may know that there is a God in Israel. So as we look at really the person of Deborah, we see someone who is unusual in that she's really the only female leader that we see who is leader over the whole nation. Actually both spiritually and in the way of ruling or leading or judging. I'm sure that in her case that there were people who looked down on her as a leader because she was a woman. First of all, people usually don't need a lot of reason to look down on a leader. For some reason, they are just the easiest people to criticize. But probably even more so as a woman. But the Spirit of God was on her, and it was very obvious. And what I think we can learn from this is that women need not be timid in giving glory to God. Women can do great things, according to the will of God. And I think sometimes we get this idea that really the only kind of woman that is acceptable to God is one who is timid and quiet, and you really don't hear from her very much. I'm not so sure that that is true. We do have some instruction in the New Testament. We'll look at that kind of here in a minute. But what we learn is that God can and does use women to lead and to deliver his people. It's easy to look in Scripture and see the large number of men and think it is only through men that God works in a leadership role, or that he blesses this only in men. But we just don't see that to be true in the person of Deborah. Women can be spiritual leaders. It's not only for men. And we can't disregard the rest of the scriptures if we're going to look at how that is to be and how it is to be in the will of God. In the New Testament, we clearly see that leadership in elders and deacons in the church are described as having wives, not being wives, but having wives. So I'm not going to talk about all of the examples and instruction that we have in the New Testament, other than I'm going to look at all of those references right now and sort everything out. I don't think that's the point of the story of Deborah. But I think we do need to be careful when we say that men are the ones who are suited for leading and teaching and bringing people to God. And saying that women are more suited for serving and caring and nurturing. Are there any men that are exempt from serving or caring or nurturing? Are there any women exempt from setting a godly example, teaching women and children, and sharing their faith? No, of course not. I believe that we must take cultural ideas of we must not take the cultural ideas that we see of leadership and say that those are attributes that God gives. We should never mix up our culture and what God's will is. God's ways are God's ways. They are not mankind's ways. And so I think sometimes we can be fooled into thinking that just because our culture is a certain way, that that's the way that God has always designed it and that's the way it always will be. God does give us instruction on how we are to give glory to Him, both men and women. And we should focus on these things and doing them, and not getting caught up in man's reasoning about what men's capabilities are or what women's capabilities are. God uses us both, in our strength and in our weaknesses. We all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. But God uses us in those things, in those strengths and in those weaknesses. Jesus is our King. And may we all submit to Him, whether male or female. May we grow in our love for Him and in our love for one another, and may we give Him the glory until He returns, no matter what roles we have here on earth. To Him be the glory.